record.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this AIM Champions office hours. Today, we're going to be discussing about performance, which is a fun topic, but performance in AIM traditional, AIM as a cloud, and essentially what still make the difference. Today, our panelists, today we have four champs. I'm going to let each one to introduce themselves. So, Daniel, I don't know if you want to go ahead and start introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel. I've been working with AEM for around 10 years. Solution architect, specializing in AEM sites and especially AEM sites that have performance issues. So I'm really looking forward to this topic. And Greg, you can go
Yep.
next.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Greg Dimmers, web product owner. Used to be with Zero Price, not there anymore. I have to update that company, but I'm still probably going to be working in the financial industry, AEM sites and assets, like Daniel said. And I've been with you since the inaugural class of AEM Champions, and looking forward to a great next year. Pass it on to Brett.
Sure. So Brett Birschbach, Executive Director of Technology at DXRY. Similar to the other guys, been working with AEM for probably 10 years now. Have my hands in a couple dozen AEM projects at this point and have managed over a couple hundred AEM projects. So kind of seen it all, done it all, and seen a lot of ways to do things poorly and some ways to do things well. So excited to chat about this topic.
Thank you, guys. I think we have over easily 35 years of experience here on AEM, so it's a great panelist to discuss about performance and some parts that I'm
That's
sure
great.
we have seen. All right, so let's start with some slides of the user groups. This week is packed of different user group sessions. Tomorrow there's one virtual event for the Benelux group is the kickoff actually, and then you have a couple hybrid and in person. Also, next week there's a one virtual event. So if you want to, know more about these events, you can just scan the code core in the screen. You can register and just to be aware of these events is always fun. You can get up to speed with all what's going on with Adobe Experience Manager. As I said, there's a new user group chapter. This is the Benelux region. Tomorrow is the kickoff meeting, so ensure to join, register this event. It's going to be fun, especially for those folks who lives around the Benelux region, which comprises Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So check out that. Also, there's a new AI community group on Experience League. So this group is dedicated for AI. If you want to share ideas, learn more from other peers of how folks are using AI these days on Adobe products, especially AEM, you can just join these groups, start your own thread or command a thread so we can just share knowledge across. We are also checking out the Experience Maker Awards. These are a special event from Adobe that celebrate innovators transforming digital experience through creativity, marketing excellence, and AI innovation. So you want to meet the finalists, you can just scan the QR code. There's a gala which will happen on Adobe Summit Las Vegas, where the winners will be announced at that spot. Finally, some user groups house rules. If you have seen, if you have been some of these events, you're aware of this, but ensure you don't pitch anyone. There's no self promotion or pitching of any kind in this type of events. Please don't contact people outside of the user group without their consent, and ensure if user group members share their use case at the user group, please don't share that information without their consent. As you will notice, this event is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can feel free to step out of the meeting and you can just watch this session on demand, which will be hosted on, I think, YouTube and some other places, so you can catch up later. And finally, stay connected with us. Ensure that you subscribe, you register to this chapter, so you can get all notifications about the events that will be coming ahead. All right, so let's start. I'll be just setting the floor for the discussion. I'll be taking like 2 minutes or so, just to get an intro in some important concepts of what we will be discussing. And performance is always a thing. Um, it's been a focus of Adobe, and generally in terms of the IT industry for quite a long time. Essentially, this is because of three things that performance can bring to you. The first one is the business impact that performance can have on you. Faster sites obviously get more conversions. This means it could be leads, sales, registers, and case study shows revenue rises when load time drops, even slightly. In the other hand, slow sites increase bounce rate, cart abandonment. So you pay sometimes for this traffic in ads or something that leaves before doing anything useful. Um, Also, performance is important in terms of user experience and brand. And users notice even small delays. People get frustrated most of the times. And unfortunately, they associate this frustration sometimes with your brand. And that's not just the side, but that's a bigger problem. Um, Better performance improve engagement and loyalty because people are more willing to browse, read, and return if everything goes faster. And marketing and SEO as well. As you know, one of the key elements for ranking your website in SEO terms is performance. So better performance helps your organic visibility as a whole. All right, so how do we actually measure a website performance? This is kind of the most traditional view. Um, when we talk about website performance, we talk about core web vitals, which are these type of standards that will tell you if your site um, is fast or no. There's some scores that we usually are familiar with, and there are some metrics that are involved into this. I won't involve into that, but just for you to know, these are kind of the standard when we don't explicitly talk about performance. Um, but also we need to consider that there's performance that happens behind what we are seeing, which is the backend performance or how our service is behaving. And this goes from a variety of sources, from API response times, CPU usage, all the resource usage, errors rates and service failures, the throughput, and so on. And there's well-known tools to measure this type of performance, both when we talk about the website performance as a whole. We always tend to speak in terms of Google Lighthouse or Google Page Speed Insights, and there are some other vendors, GTmetrix, Debugbear, that helps and actually use those metrics to put a final score on your website that is visible and used for SEO. But also there are some tools that are used to measure how your backend is behaving. So if we are doing monitoring, we have tools like New Relic, Splunk, um, Grafana. If we are doing some sort of load testing, we have Gmeter, K6, and so on. So with that intro, I think we are good to start our discussion and see what we can share and learn about um, performance today. So I'm just gonna stop sharing here. And something I did not explicitly said, but I think it's important to mention is that we want to engage people in this type of session. So please feel free to just raise your hand if you want to be a participant of the call. We want to hear you, so just feel free to speak up. You want to instead just drop a Q&A, there's a Q&A section where we can answer your question, and we will try to address as many questions as we get and as we can. So with that, let's start with a couple of questions that we have here. So first question here, do we really need to aim for very high performance scores in tools like Lighthouse, or is that different from giving user a fast and a smooth experience? And can chasing high scores actually hurt real user experience?
Yes.
Who would
Will
like
you call out someone,
Happy
or
to take that.
who wants to take it first?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's important. Is hitting 100 on every single page load important? I'm going to stand up and say no. And this is just my experience talking to a lot of different clients. I've never, ever had a client come to me and say, I need all my site to be 100. Now, obviously, if it's poorly performing, yes, it's got to be better. But I mean, I've seen full-on sites where literally every page is scoring in the 20s and nobody cares. Now, I'm not saying that's acceptable either, but I'm just trying to tell you where most other places, like a lot of places that I deal with, are. Now, if you're an e-commerce company, it's going to be a lot more important. But if you're talking like corporate sites, marketing sites, etc., like anything that's in the 80s is going to be totally fine, probably. And there's a lot of things that are beyond your control with marketing pixels and stuff that are just going to necessarily bring that score down from 100. I think the key with that, and I'll turn it over to like Daniel. I think he's probably got some things to say. Is chase the scores only to the extent that you're not doing things that are awkward, that are like purposely trying to get the high score. Like I've definitely seen places where it's like, well, but if we delay the rendering of this or whatever, it makes the score go higher. It's like, yeah, but then the page is blank for the user. It's actually a worse experience to me as a user, even though it tricks Lighthouse into saying it's a higher score. So I like once you get to that point where you're trying to game the system to get the better score, you've probably gone too far.
Yeah.
Yeah, fully agree with Brett there. So I think we should aim for a good score and align internally what that means, 80, 90 maybe. And what's important to measure it, right? Because if you don't measure it constantly, you will drop at some point. So I think that constant measurement is really a great thing. Whether it can hurt user experience, yes, definitely. I've seen that. Same as Brett mentioned. So doing a lot of timeouts or weird kind of loading behavior where, something that should pop up immediately for the end user because they see it, it doesn't. It gets delayed because it's not measured by Lighthouse. So I've seen that we are trying to kind of optimize more for the Lighthouse bot than we are trying to optimize for the end users, which doesn't make sense. But yeah, it's those metrics that we have, those metrics that the marketing team is looking at, and they want them high, which is also understandable. But you need to draw the line somewhere and not hurt user experience because of getting a few bumps on Lighthouse scores that no one really cares about.
Yeah, it's almost like Lighthouse is a regression detector, right? Like not a score to look to maximize your results. Like the value is catching regressions. And
comparative scoring. Yeah. Like how are we scoring before the release? How are we scoring after the release? Or even, hey, we're scoring really well on these type of pages, but we're scoring really poorly on this type of page. And you realize, oh, geez, our accordion is extremely non-performant or whatever. Yeah. Those things. I think comparing pages to pages makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, especially with things like you deployed a image, for example, if we're talking about assets and there's no width height ratio attribute there, that will be an indication in your Lighthouse score that you have to look at that, for example, and address that. So it's accidental deployments, things like that will show up, and it will be a good indication for you to look at those areas of concern. But it's kind of like synthetic score. It's not looking at exactly where your problem areas might be.
And I think you need to always try to define that line. I think defining line is the most complex things, because you need to put together marketers and people who are engaged with business and revenue and technicians, and trying to come into an agreement. I think that's the challenge in reality. So you can decide, this is course is going to be okay, and user experience sometimes is better assessment depending of the type of business. So yeah, great thoughts. All right, so next one for our champs. How much do architectural decisions and the chosen tech stack influence overall performance across both front end and back end in AEM? Daniel, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting one because I've just been thinking what to say, because it does impact in some areas, but also like mostly it doesn't, because like most performance issues, they actually show up during like the development phase, like during delivery. So I think what you can do as an architect in this like initial design phases is probably the best thing you can do is set up good quality gates. And that can be quality gates for Lighthouse, quality gate, or ways of working. For example, how do you address issues? So what happens when a new null pointer pops up, for example, in your instance? Do you catch it? Do you have tools that can identify it? Will you have like a zero bug policy in your team that every bug gets resolved immediately, or will you let them pile up with years and then have thousands and thousands, if not millions? I think these are some things that where like thinking ahead and like giving a good architectural design and guidelines to the development team really makes a difference. But still, you can never oversee everything, right? Things will happen during development. Devs will write queries that are slow, that are not covered by indexes, stuff like that. So it's always kind of a mix. I think you can think about some things ahead, make sure you have the right tools, make sure you have the right processes in place. But it's also having the right development team and coaching them, training them, working together with them. So it's both yes and a no.
Nice. So a follow-up question on this: which early architectural decisions in an AEM project have the biggest long-term impact on website performance and on your experience, if there's any? Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the one thing that like understand that yes, AEM is a CMS, but it is probably the fastest CMS to render server side that I've ever seen in my life. If your pages are not rendering in a quarter second or less from the server, something's probably wrong. One of the architecture decisions that I have seen send it down this path where like pages were taking 2-3 seconds to load was extremely granular creation of Sling models in the whole HTL process. So Sling models are awesome. HTL, hook it up to your Sling models, you get code completion, all that stuff, type safety, things that you want. However, I sometimes see this taken to an nth degree where it's like, hey, we want every single sublink to have its own Sling model, and every link within that have like little pieces. It's like, hey, I have a sub object that's represents a URL and a label, but then a parent object that's a URL and a label that are in that object, plus maybe some other parameter. And when you nest all these Sling models down in extremely granular fashion, if you think of like a header or a footer that might have 50 nested links in it, and if it's constructing 50 different Sling models on every single page load, each one of those might be 50 milliseconds, but times that by 50 and you all of a sudden got 2.5 seconds. Right. So that is actually one. I saw it and it's like, man, I can see conceptually, architecturally why that seems like such a great idea to make everything super granular and such. But it actually was a situation where it didn't work well in AEM for that particular case. The other architectural decision I would say that more for the front end would be decide what you're going to do with the grid, the layout grid. Yep. That thing is heavy as heck. It is like 500 megabytes. 500 kilobytes, or it's a very big CSS file if you use the default. So number one, the less breakpoints that you configure for authors, and it only affects what you're configuring for authors. So like I would recommend not going any more than 3. So two different breakpoints with 3 different viewports, because it basically exponentiates out because of how much CSS gets generated. Or alternatively, you can rebuild that CSS with modern CSS rather than doing the out of the box way. Or 3, I've actually heard, and I don't recommend it, but I've seen in some cases where we just don't want layout mode. Just get rid of that because it is an extremely heavy CSS file. Those are a couple that I've seen.
Great. Thanks, Brett. A follow-up on that. How much do content modeling and repository structure have on backend performance in AEM, and what should teams consider when designing their content architecture?
Yeah, that's another one that decision that's hard to fix later if you don't set it up correctly. I'm thinking of like poorly designed content model, and references that are rather lengthy, nested fragment references, overloading models with 20 plus fields, and you can conflate your structured data in there. That's in the front end, you get GraphQL queries that have enormous payloads, and so that's kind of harder to fix later. So instead of like overstacking your content fragments, for example, like that, you could keep them rather shallow, 2 levels, maximum nesting, and separate your editorial content from your structured data. And if you see like a content model that requires more than 8 to 10 fields, then you're doing a little bit too much there, and it's doing 2 jobs. So I think that's one of the areas that I wanted to point out.
Nice. Yeah, I was thinking what Brett was mentioning, and this is not necessarily related to the repository structure, but I've seen a lot of times in order to decouple the grid system, there's this pattern of nesting containers within containers, and that also can create some bottlenecks. Server time rendering, and that causes a lot of performance issues. So I think going to back a little bit, the layout is really important. Once you the flexibility you want to give your authors, how much they are prepared to handle a layout system, and how you actually deliver that will have definitely a high impact on performance overall.
If I can add one more thing, I think the main pattern that I've seen affecting performance or causing negative performance on AEM is putting stuff that shouldn't go into AEM into AEM, mostly importing stuff into JCR. So as long as you use AEM as a CMS as you are supposed to use it, then AEM can handle like crazy amounts of content. Like I worked on projects that have more than hundreds of sites and them having 60 plus market languages, no issues at all. And then you start importing something that shouldn't go into AEM, like product data, for example.
Yeah.
And then you have performance issues. So as long as you like use the system what it's for, especially if you're on cloud service, and put the other surrounding things into their own systems or microservices, then I think you're most of the time good.
Nice. Nice. We have another question. I guess this will be for Daniel. It's one of his favorite topics, I guess. How important is caching strategy in AEM these days? Particular dispatcher and CDN layers, and what are the most common mistakes teams still make?
How important is caching strategy? I mean, it's super important when you deliver sites that are supposed to reach end users globally, right? So CDN is like a no-brainer. So we had it long time before cloud service, right? And works great. It's always a little bit tricky to kind of configure and decide, because there are different ways how you can invalidate cache, but maybe let's not go into that topic. That's a complex one. But the important thing is like to agree with your editors and marketing team, like what is acceptable in terms of caching. So if you can do TTL, that's, you know, much easier to implement. If you can't, you can always do invalidation when you need stuff live right at the same time, but you probably don't need it for every page. So you can always kind of mix and match where it makes sense. I would say dispatcher is an interesting topic to discuss, because it is becoming less important than it used to be, in my opinion, in cloud service. So mostly we still use it on project because it's kind of a gatekeeper for AEM publisher. So I think it still serves a purpose in the traditional AEM setup. In headless setups, not so much. I think there are cases where you might consider completely disabling it. If you have, for example, Next.js in front, that's also doing caching, then it kind of loses its purpose. But yeah, caching has always been a fun and interesting topic in the AEM world, and it will continue to be so. Maybe with a few tweaks here and there.
Yeah, Brett.
Brett?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to it, that Daniel said, is like the place that I would be mindful of, because it's easy to overlook, is that you're not accidentally subverting the caching through query parameters. Where I see this happen most is pages that have different states that the developers want to preserve the different states. So for instance, a PDP that has different product variations, or even just like things like, hey, I'm on a page, but I'm switching between tabs and I want to track which tab I'm on in the query string. Using the URL hash instead of the query string to do that, so that you're not actually triggering full page loads to the system. It seems obvious, but it's one of those things that, especially when developers are working locally, the things load so fast that it's easy to not even notice that it's making full trips reloading the entire page from the server for something that you don't need to. And then the second thing being the marketing, the marketing parameters, just making sure that you've actually configured that. The CDN has its own configuration. That's kind of default in cloud service nowadays. But if you're not using that, or if you're not in cloud service yet, you might need to configure it there. But certainly also there's like the marketing parameters in the dispatcher, just making sure that any marketing pixels coming in aren't, again, subverting your caching.
If I can just add to that, Brett, I just you now triggered one thought in my head. So it's like, I guess everyone who's been working with AEM for a longer time, you know these patterns, right? What kind of hurts cache performance? What are some best practices, etc. But in my opinion, like the important thing is to have really tools that visualize it and that can kind of alert you if such cases happen. So it can be maybe a dashboard in Splunk or something like that, where you actually kind of from release to release compare how many requests. You don't have to compare each and every request, it's going to be millions, but what are like the top 20 or top 30 requests I'm hitting on publisher compared to dispatcher, and check, with every release, are those numbers like kind of make sense, and am I getting, for example, a lot of hits on AEM publisher for a pass that should be cached in dispatcher, because that obviously then indicates an issue and probably something you need to look into your configuration.
Nice.
Yeah, love it.
Cool. I think the next question is just a follow-up on this
By the way,
one.
Esteban, did you see we do have a couple things in the Q&A? Just want to make sure.
Let's go with those first then. Raf is asking. I was always a fan of how Asset Microservices now doing the heavy lifting in AEM as a cloud, so it doesn't impact authors with bogging down the author instance. Are there other performance bottlenecks you are aware of now that some clients are using Asset as a multi-terabyte repository?
Not specifically related to assets, but this did trigger one thing to be aware of that people should be using, because I see this a lot. workflows and capturing events, workflows and event listeners. It's very tempting for developers like, hey, when something happens, I want to do a thing, and making sure that they're offloading them to jobs instead of doing the thing directly in the listener or in the workflow. Is super important to ensure that you don't overwork AEM. And it's also very important in AEM Cloud Service to make sure that it actually executes once within the cluster. And if a server happens to go down in the middle of a long process, that it'll restart that job when the next server comes up, because servers are automatically switching in AEM Cloud Service. So it's both a performance thing as well as a redundancy thing. But that is definitely something that I've seen be a performance bottleneck when people put a lot of that stuff running synchronously within either event listeners or workflows.
Cool.
One more thing that comes to mind is that you shouldn't be streaming assets anymore into kind of your Java code in AEM, because they are in cloud service, they are in separate binary storage. So that's, I think Adobe now raises this as a major issue in your code quality pipeline if you do that. So it still works, but we are discouraged to do it, and I know it's tempting. Basically, when you need to work with assets, I mean, mostly it's now going in this direction of asset microservice, kind of have your microservice for whatever you're doing with an asset, and that's actually the right architectural approach. And if you need to import, for example, a lot of assets in cloud service, so that's not done through AEM anymore. That there are even helper node packages where you can really easily, like in any technology, it doesn't have to be Adobe I/O, it can be something different like a Lambda or whatever, in a simple way upload your assets directly to the binary storage. So basically avoid any asset operation in AEM directly in the Java code would be the pattern. And other performance bottlenecks, I mean, what I've seen lately is also related to workflows. We did have some issues with dynamic media workflows running when there is a lot of changes and a lot of assets and you have dynamic media. So there's going to be a ton of workflows running. The tricky thing with workflows is that they can negatively impact one another. So if you have 2 or 3 workflows operating on the same nodes, you might get some exceptions in Oak. So that's a very common pattern, and sometimes very hard to avoid. Even the out-of-the-box workflows can sometimes conflict with each other. So those may be worth mentioning.
Yeah, and that particular situation, I've run into that, where that's another great case where maybe using a job and you tell the job, hey, only 1 instance per time, and you just have the workflows simply queue up a bunch of jobs instead of actually doing the update themselves, so that centralized node gets updated in a synchronous 1 job at a time. It makes the whole operation maybe take a little bit longer, but not super longer. But yes, because workflows, even if they're all started at different times, doesn't mean that the first one started is going to run before the second one runs. So yes, they all run kind of at the same time and they update the same node, and that you'll end up with these Oak exceptions that are just random in the code base, and they only happen once in a while, and it's like, why is this happening? So good call out there, Daniel.
One thing that was out there, like I had seen a note, is that if you have your own CDN, smart imaging, as far as assets are concerned, is not available at, I think, when I looked at last time. So if you bring in your own CDN, so you don't get cache invalidation, the hot link support, so that was another item that I had seen in several feedback. If you're using smart imaging with your own CDN, you have to have Adobe CDN.
Cool. Hey guys.
But I do have, I mean, you are referring to dynamic media kind of
Yes.
smart imaging, smart crops.
Yeah,
I have it on Akamai, it works fine.
Okay. Maybe it was older information.
Could be. But yeah, so I can confirm it works fine, at least on my project, with a custom CDN. So smart imaging and those kind of hotspots on the images, so all of those dynamic media features we are using, with a custom CDN. The thing with dynamic media is dynamic media has its own CDN, right? So if you purchase dynamic media, it's kind of its own product, and it doesn't go through Fastly. They actually use Akamai, but Adobe hosted Akamai.
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah.
what that's exactly that. Yeah, the distinction. Yeah.
Cool. Another question we have is there a guideline on how big a page should be to have an acceptance performance, ignoring the complexity of the page?
So this is basically what we were talking about earlier, where, and I think Daniel maybe mentioned, or where if you have a bunch of nested components, it's less about how big the page is and more about how many nodes that you use to construct it, and then how performant it is for your backend to render those nodes. Going back to that situation I was talking about earlier, where if all of your containers all have a Sling model that all does all the calculation up front, you don't have things lazily calculated. That's another method you can use in the backend, is lazily calculate things only when they're asked for, rather than, I've seen a lot of Sling models where people just pound a bunch of code into init model, which is basically, hey, when you construct this model, calculate every last thing that might possibly be in here so that it's all ready for when anybody asks for it. Yeah. And when you do that, and if you have nested container to achieve layouts or whatever, that can be non-performant, but I would say that's more of a problem of the implementation, less of a problem that you have that many nodes. If you ever worked in AEM guides, some of the pages that get generated by AEM guides have 1,000 nested nodes. I'm not even joking in terms of the number. Like, it's just a zillion of them, because the way how it generates. And those pages, they're a little slower to render, but they actually render just fine. Sometimes you actually have to tell AEM it's okay that there's this many nestings. It actually will bail out because it thinks, hey, am I in an infinite loop? And it'll actually bail out because there's so many nodes that it thinks that it's stuck. And once you tell it, no, keep going, it'll still render in less than a second for 1,000 child nodes. So I just think, it's going to vary by implementation. And if you are running into problems, I would look into, like, do we have overly nested nodes for no really good reason? Is there a better way we can do that?
Global navigation components are usually culprits too. Yeah. Anything that gets repeated like that and it's nested information and it gets repeated in page templates and different pages, will drag you down performance wise.
Yeah, but if you mean page size in terms of like how many components I add to a page, that should not affect performance, in my opinion. So you can do performance tests with JMeter K6 on how fast your HTML responses are. So ideally, it should be under a second, always. That's related to backend performance. Related to frontend performance, I mean, Lighthouse mostly cares about the initial viewport. So you can have 100 components below the initial viewport and still get like the same Lighthouse scores. So it will mostly focus on, like, the LCP, how many JavaScript you load and stuff like that. So not really how big a page is or how many components you have on the page.
Yeah, there's this forgotten menu, the developer mode in the author experience. Remember that? Usually, if you click on that, you get at least a glance of how many milliseconds each component will render. And actually, to me, just to find the depth, or if a component is too buried into a nested pattern, sometimes that's useful as well. But to Daniel's point, as long as the components are flat, you can have 1,000 components that the page should render just good. So
we are not recommending to have thousands, just to be clear.
Thank you for the clarification, just in case. Always good.
Yeah, good call out though, Esteban, on the developer, that sidebar that you can look at. It's a good way to debug why it's taking so long to render a page.
Yeah, at least you can see, which component could be the culprit or so. Cool. There's a follow-up, the Raf drop in the chat. I was always a fan of how. Oh no, sorry, that is a question.
Yeah, we covered it.
Okay, cool. So let's go back to our discussion about cache, and defining a cache strategy. It's is sometimes challenging if you don't really know what things you need to address. So what key things you think are key for you to define a good resilient cash strategy for AEM?
I've been talking a lot, so I'll let someone else answer if you want.
I mean, starting from the default, your CDN, I mean, most things that are being served from AEM sites are going to be marketing sites and marketing content. Like all that should be cached. Like, and if there's any gaps in any of your marketing static type pages, people that aren't like where people are not logged in and not seeing data that's specific to themselves, like that's just pretty straightforward. And so it's interesting, even considering the question of CDN strategy, because really the CDN strategy for those pages, yeah, they should cache, period. And then they just kind of clear normally. I mean, using the normal TTL in the CDN is generally recommended. You can actually set up nowadays on Fastly. You can set up so that you can trigger a clearing of the Fastly cache if that 5 to 10 minutes. I think it's five minutes for pages, 10 minutes for assets. I can't remember for sure. You can clear that as well if authors need to see their change absolutely immediately. But like, it's pretty straightforward. Like you shouldn't have to configure anything to get that default caching. Just kind of by default, if you're not subverting the cache, it'll just work. I think once you start getting into logged in pages, that becomes a lot more tricky if you can determine how to do that. And there's things like, Sling Dynamic includes to include certain parts of the pages, and it's debatable whether how big a difference those things make. I'd be curious if anybody's got any thoughts there. And that's more in the dispatcher. I'm not sure. Does Fastly support edge side includes? Do you know, Daniel or Esteban?
I think it does. I know, Daniel, you.
I'm using it on Akamai. I don't know about Fastly.
Okay. I was going to say, because I've not tried doing it on because that's always another thing to consider is edge side includes to, maximize your CDN caching when you do have dynamic information. That's obviously a lot more of a complex architectural decision. It's always going to be a little bit specific to the implementation.
Yeah, I would be surprised if it's not supported. So there's a lot of stuff actually coming that came out on the Adobe out-of-the-box Fastly in the recent years. I think, like in terms of features, it's way more configurable than it used to be. Just maybe one more thing to add would be is you can also set no cache header for some specific pages that have a lot of dynamic data, or if you have this kind of login experience page, and AEM can handle it. I've seen it on very big projects without any performance issues. I'm not saying that's the best practice. I think what Brad said still makes much more sense to kind of keep those areas that are personalized or contain some login information, keep them like separated, maybe fetch them on the front end or use ESI, that's better. But you can also completely bypass CDN cache, and if you don't have too big of a scale, AEM as a cloud server should be able to handle the load.
Cool. Yeah, something I just want to throw as well is sometimes we tend to cache everything without thinking on how to flush this and how this will actually be invalidated. And I think invalidation is one thing that we need to keep in mind when you actually try to define something that works pretty well. Daniel already said that, sometimes you always need to get with people who will be using the website, the authors, and they agree with the TTLs, either you're using TTLs, because otherwise it could be a headache just to get some fresh content if you're not really aware how the invalidation process works on these different layers. Good. So let's talk about, Daniel already mentioned some of that. Always good to have some tooling so we can get a good view of how things are behaving. So based on your experience, what are the best ways to detect front-end and back-end performance issues in production before they affect users?
That's a super interesting topic. I think like the whole monitoring kind of thing is what I've seen on a lot of projects kind of gets down prioritized by feature requests. And then what happens, right, as usual on big scale enterprise projects, it comes to bite you later. So it's always a great idea to start to have as much monitoring as you can from the beginning and start addressing like all those performance issues from the beginning. I'll maybe mention like what I'm using right now, just as an example. And I think probably many others are kind of using the same tools or similar tools at least. So we do get New Relic out of the box from Adobe. It's great. You can identify a lot of stuff in there, a lot of performance issues. So for example, you can find slow database requests, although you can in AEM also. You can find slow transactions, slowed third-party APIs. A lot of that data sits in New Relic. What's not so great about New Relic that comes with AEM as a cloud service, it's kind of view only. So you can't get alerts when things happen. And this is, I think, quite a big shortback in my opinion, because I would like to get alerts when things become slow on AEM and kind of address them proactively instead of having to like, I have a reminder in my calendar every 2 weeks, I check a New Relic. But there are other tools, like for example, if you send your logs to Splunk, you can create a lot of cool stuff in Splunk with Splunk queries. You can create dashboards. You can look at, responses, response times. You can look at the number of errors that you're getting. And if you have Splunk licensed, obviously, then you can also create alerts in Splunk. And you can set up as many as you want. So, for example, a good example is traversal queries. So, for example, it's super simple to set up in Splunk. So whenever a traversal warning pops up in the logs, so just like forward it on to Slack to the dev team so they can have a look. And in a simple way, you avoid a lot of performance issues because a lot of performance issues in AEM are related to traversing the JCR tree instead of using proper indexes, etc. Besides that, for performance testing, I think front end is obvious, like automation with Lighthouse. What is important is I would mention to run it on lower environments, not just production, because you don't want to degrade performance a lot before it reaches production. So what I would usually at least check it on a lower level environment like stage and int before approving the release to go to production. Similar to like how we do visual testing. And regarding backend performance, I use mostly K6 because it's super simple to do, and I like all the visual tools from Grafana. And kind of similar thing to Lighthouse. So you measure every results of every release on a lower level environment, so you can trigger them automatically after you deploy it to a specific environment before production, and then you can compare to the results before and have thresholds, etc. So that's kind of the stack that I'm using mostly these days.
Yeah,
Cool.
the time to first byte is the primary backend indicator. Is that what you're thinking, Daniel? Like, it's your cleanest indicator of like looking at page templates, regions where your content is distributed, cache status. I was reading that time to first byte is like what you should be looking at as your indicator of like performance backend. But
if you are on classic AEM, then yes, but that gets a little tricky as soon as you start having some front-end frameworks, and then like it's a completely different story. But
Yeah, real quick PSA, and good thing you have that 2-week reminder for those that like, hey, I'm going to set up cloud service New Relic, and then I'm going to go look at it whenever I know there's a problem. If you don't log into it, I think it's 30 days. They
Yes.
shut your account down. So actually, it's a really good habit to have that every 2 weeks. Go take a look, because you'll keep your account active in there. It's all a part of your cloud service licensing, but if nobody's using it, I think they shut it down probably to save on their own licensing that they're passing through to New Relic. But yeah, there's a couple things like that. The other thing that you should always have a reminder is like periodically review the build report and see if there's anything in the build report, things like leaks and stuff that could lead to performance issues, etc. Because there is no, unless you get so bad that it fails your build, it's not really reminding you that like things are stacking up in that report either. So that's another thing to just periodically check. You probably have a few of those just in your calendar reminders.
Yeah, I think you have at least these tools out of the box. It's great if you can. Sometimes budget constraint, you cannot put some good monitor, as Daniel was mentioning, but at least you have this lighthouse scoring every time you run the pipeline. So at least you have a glance of how you're in your next cycle, how your website is performing. Also, New Relic, we have been talking. Also, you have available. You can easily nowadays open and spin up these ELK stack. You can just download the logs from your CDN fastly, and you can get Adobe has set up this predefined dashboard, so you can get at least a glance of caching, contact requests, and so on. So you have some tooling available that you can just take advantage of these days. So I think it's good at least to have these mind to try to monitor as much as you can, because that actually is also is related to performance. So thanks for that, Daniel and Brett.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned, visualizing logs is probably, out of all the things I mentioned, I think the most important thing, because I don't think as many are doing it. I think everyone should be visualizing logs, because it is impossible to check production logs manually, like line by line. So you need to have visualizations. You need to have tools to be able to prioritize, like what is a big, you will never come to a level where you don't have errors in your logs in AEM as a cloud service on a complex project. You will always have errors, and you will have thousands. You will sometimes have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. So you need to prioritize, right? So you need to fix the ones that are actually performance issues, that are actually impacting users, get as many of them fixed, and kind of iteration by iteration. So a good practice is always like create 2 or 3 tech debt tickets, stuff you find in the logs, stuff you find in, for example, K6, whatever, and like try to agree with the PO to add 2 or 3 of those tickets to every iteration. Like otherwise, a different scenario is doing this kind of tech debt sprints from time to time. But I personally like this continuous, like kind of tech debt addressing strategy way more. Maybe that's something, Greg, for you to comment.
Yeah, no, I when you say visualization of the logs, you mean the setting up tools to be able to, like dashboards to be able to visualize? Yeah, that would be also helpful in what we discussed earlier with discussions with your teams on like prioritizing, content caching strategy and everything. So I totally agree with that. Being able to communicate,
you're prioritizing the backlog, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you're a product owner, you're trying to get those tickets in. Like, hey, look, it's actually causing a problem, right?
Yeah, being able to communicate that is to break it down, basically why you're doing what you're doing and why you're doing it the way you're doing it, what your caching strategy is. Yeah, that's the only comment I have there. Sorry, I was just looking at the questions, and when you asked me, Daniel, I think we have
questions.
We have a few. Yeah, let's try to cover those. Maybe
a couple more. Yeah.
Great. So Lavanya is asking any recommendations for migrating an existing AEM Forms project to AEM as a cloud server in terms of performance. What factors should be considered strongly? Anyone? I think one of the misconceptions, at least I deal this with people sometimes, is that when you actually migrate from on-premise to on cloud, if you don't do anything particular on your code base or something intentional to increase performance, the performance will be exactly the same. So I think that's is not the case on EDS, where you know this is performance first tool and everything is somehow refactored almost from scratch. But doing a migration from traditional on-premise to as a cloud service, if you don't do anything on purpose, if you have performance issues, you still have performance issues on cloud unless you solve them. And usually you ended up solving those things during the migration if those are kind of criticals, and there's some tooling that mark those as critical patterns that can actually put it in a better shape, and that way you can achieve better performance overall on the cloud. But it's not as magical as we thought, as it will be on edge delivery services, for example. So any thoughts on this one?
I think with jumping from on-prem or managed services to cloud, like everything, it sounds to me like you have to design everything around your CDN hit ratio. And no matter how performant your Java code is, like if you're ignoring that, if your pages are missing CDN, requests and they hit AEM publish directly, that's an area of concern compared to like how you were doing things before. Because Edge network, like the CDN plays a different role in cloud as opposed to on-prem, obviously, and managed services.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any particular concerns though when it comes to like AEM forms, like anything specific that you need to do on cloud service compared to on-prem.
Yeah.
I think it's just the general considerations of migration.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Rajesh is asking, are there any performance benchmarks on AEM as a cloud service APIs, like Content Fragments Delivery Open API? Also, are there any throttling limits for these APIs on cloud?
There are always limits, but the good thing is that the limits are pretty high. I think it's around 200 requests per second per environment, something like that. Don't take my word for it, but it's written down somewhere.
Yeah.
Regarding performance benchmarks, I mean, I haven't seen anything published from Adobe, so they probably use something internally, but I don't know what, or they don't publish those results, obviously, because that's something you keep internal to your team if you are like the API provider. Kind of the rule is if the out-of-the-box API is not performing to your expectations, you can, of course, raise a support ticket, but it can also be related to how you kind of create the content, right? If you have deep nesting, can create complex queries also, so that's going to affect performance. So
Right.
I haven't worked a lot with GraphQL, so maybe someone else can add a few more words there.
No, I think you got a good point. If you're pushing up against the request limit, you probably have other considerations, including your content requests, which you're going to hit up against. And so it does come down to how do you structure your content? How do you return your content?
Yep.
Sometimes it's going to be actually more performant to have a custom servlet to fetch the data that you want that just traverses the node structure rather than running a query. Sometimes some of this data, like, if it's fetching certain parts of your data structure might be pretty stable and not really based on any sort of parameters, like, okay, can that be cached in some way so that you're not actually fetching it, and cached not only on the server side, but cached in the browser, right? Like, don't fetch the same thing on every single page load if it's data that doesn't change very often, or it's fine to go for a whole session. Store it in session storage or local storage or whatever, so that you're just reducing these overall calls to the server. It's good for both your server performance as well as your content requests to AEM Cloud Service, which is how you get licensed and your overall cost.
Yeah. You have a fully cacheable HTML shell from CDN and then hydrating your pages from your content client side from your APIs from a separate API endpoint. That goes back to the CDN hit ratio I was mentioning earlier. Like that's the whole idea with performant AEM as a cloud service.
We're at time.
Cool. Yep, I think we're in time.
I think Esteban, you maybe had a very interesting question that we haven't had time to go through, but I would just really briefly like to mention it before we close. Is can we make classic AEM as performant as the new stuff, Next.js, Edge Delivery Services? Just want to quickly answer that. Yes, we can, but it's more work because the new kind of front-end stuff, EDS, Next.js, they have a lot of optimizations out of the box. So you don't have to do them yourself, right? Yeah. But no one can tell me that we cannot make server-side rendered AEM pages score as highly on Lighthouse as whatever other tool there is. We can. It's just a lot more work.
Yeah.
Exactly.
100% agree.
Yep. I think that's the last comment, the last idea we want to let everyone with is that, performance, there's a lot of things, but you can actually get higher scores. You can actually get good performance server and backend. It's just a matter of how you actually design, how you, put together your teams, your development. Daniel mentioned about, the development is we can start with something which is pretty performant, and over time it will downgrade. So we just need to continuously think, have this mindset of have performance on the whole cycle, so we don't lose it at some point. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining to this session, and I think we will catch up later at some point.
See you in the next one. Yep. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you guys.
Bye for
Bye.
joining.
Thanks for hosting, Esteban. Bye.